Hello, my name is Allison Hammond, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending tonight's presentation. The Dole Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students committed to the work of the Dole Institute. We attend regular meetings, assist in events like this one, and plan an SAB-sponsored program every semester. Members of the SAB receive great opportunities to network with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. Your attendance and feedback help shape future programming. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the interview, we will have some time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student helper with a microphone will come to you. Please ask just one brief question. And now, please welcome Dole Institute Director, Bill Lacy.
Thanks, Allison. Thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. We really appreciate your support of this program. We had about 180 people here this afternoon, some watching out here on the video screen. I want to know how many people were here for the afternoon session. So, did you like the afternoon sessions? Excellent. Excellent. So, it's all because of the great group of folks that we've assembled for this program, and I'm going to introduce them very, very briefly in just a moment. I'm going to make a couple of quick announcements. First, there is a big date coming up for the Dole Institute. On July 22, we'll not only celebrate our 10th anniversary of our dedication, but also Senator Bob Dole's 90th birthday. Now, to honor Senator Dole on the occasion, we have a huge birthday card back here, which we would encourage everybody to sign and put a little note on. So if you didn't see it and sign it on the way in, see it and sign it on the way out. It'll be here at the Dole Institute for a few days before the 22nd. You're also all invited back the 22nd. It's the afternoon of the 22nd. We'll be having cupcakes and a party in honor of Senator Dole. It'll be kind of just drop by, sign the card, get a cupcake, say hello, and just to bid him a happy birthday. So we hope some of you can join us for that. Second announcement I wanted to make tonight is we have all of the books. There is in your program tonight a bibliography that the panelists pulled together of important Gettysburg books that they thought you might like to read if you have time to do that. Those books are all on sale out front from the KU bookstore, so please take advantage of that and pick up some of those books on your way out tonight. Now, the success today has really been driven by our 6 participants. They've done a fabulous job. We debated for a long time how to introduce them tonight, because we gave them all proper introductions. We'd be spending about 20 minutes on the introductions rather than on the program. And so I'm just going to simply ask each of our historian experts who are to my right to stand as I name them, and ask you to applaud and welcome them to the Dole Institute KU. And I'm going to ask you to read their bios, which are in your program, to find out more details. But let's start with Dr. Terry Beckenbaugh from the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. Terry? Next is Dr. Ethan Rayfuse of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. Ethan? Next is Dr. Deborah Sheffer from Park University. Deb? And last but not least, certainly, KU's own Dr. Jennifer Weber. Jenny? These guys are going to cover each one of the 7 critical decisions that we discussed tonight. On stage with me tonight are Dr. Steve Lauer, the U.S. Army of Advanced Military Studies. Steve is right to my left. And to his left is Dr. Kevin Benson, U.S. Army University of Foreign Military and Cultural Studies. What a mouthful. And as your program says, Kevin actually played a critical role in putting all of this program together, recruiting the panelists, and really being of great assistance to me in the Dole Institute of Politics. Let's go ahead and get started on the program, and I'm going to direct the first question tonight to Kevin, but Steve, I want you to jump in on it too. But how the panel kind of discussed the 7 decisions. What was the methodology? How did you select the 7 decisions?
When you asked me to start bringing this together back in February, I asked Jenny and Steve first. They were the first 2 folks I started to talk with. What do you think? What do you think of the 7 most critical decisions that were taken? I got their feedback, I drew up my own, and then floated them out to everybody, and we kicked it around through email, and Ethan and Terry and Deb made terrific contributions to this too. So the end result of the 7 decisions that we came up with was really consensus from all of us, with, again, great feedback from all of the real Civil War historians, because I am not one. I just like to read about it. Where did 7 come from? 7 is just an arbitrary number. Bill actually suggested it, and I deferred to him because I figured, well, 7, that'd be a good number to be able to discuss within the time limit that we have tonight. So,
was there pretty much a solid consensus, or did a couple of suggestions not make the list? We're going to get into the
none of mine made
ones,
the list.
None of yours made the list? Okay.
That's okay. No, it was. It really was. There was a lot of great give and take, and what stands out is my new colleague and best friend Terry Beckenbach proposed a list after I floated the one that I'd come up with reasons that were outlined that were really terrific. I mean, that's the value of having folks who really have made a personal study of this broad topic, the Civil War, participate in something like this. So, yeah, there were some that didn't make it, and why not? Some maybe didn't raise to the level of what's a grand kind of decision, what in the consensus of the group was one that was truly had an effect on either the day of a particular day of the battle or the battle itself. So that's pretty much what we did.
Kevin's actually minimizing the effort here, because when you get a bunch of PhDs together who ask a bunch of questions, there's a lot of questions. So at one point, Kevin refereed and said, "All right, we're done. No more questions. Let's just pick the 7 and go." So PhDs are that way.
Okay. What I'd like to do now, Kevin and Steve, is have you guys, however you figured this out, to kind of outline the main actions that are taking place on the 1st, 2nd, and the 3rd day during the battle, so everybody kind of has a basis of knowledge as we go into the 7 decisions. We can do this briefly, but just let's start with day 1. What are the key things folks need to know?
Okay. And I know that my colleagues over here are going to help me on this, especially if I stray. But this is, in the vernacular that I grew up with in the Army, it was a meeting engagement. The Union cavalry came through Gettysburg, and there was initial contact with Confederate infantry. And the cavalry commander took the decision that I'm going to stay here, this is good ground. He communicated that to the Union wing commander, Major General John Reynolds. So the cavalry is going to stay and cover until the Union infantry comes up. The Confederate infantry, I'm not going to be discomfited by cavalry, so they uncoil, come on line of battle, begin the fight. Union infantry come in, more Confederate forces come in. The 11th Union Corps is on the ground that the 1st Union Corps is on, which is good ground, does not quite, as was discussed earlier today, favor the defensive positions of the 11th Union Corps. Instead of having nice rolling terrain where I'm on high ground, the Confederates have got to come up, the valleys are running north and south, and it doesn't afford anyone any advantage, and it's tough to dig in. So the Confederates have the advantage on the right flank in the 1st day of the battle. The battle ends that 1st day. There's 2 Union Corps who are essentially crushed, which is what Lee wanted to do. Take elements of the Union Army and defeat them in detail. Confederate forces are still coming up. Union forces are still coming up. There's significant pieces of ground that for one reason or another, the Confederates don't seize Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, just south of the town of Gettysburg, but it sort of shakes out into a rather victorious first day of battle for the Army of Northern Virginia.
Now, let me just take a step back beyond that just to set that stage a little bit for you. The Union and Confederate armies had just fought the Battle of Chancellorsville, which was a spectacular Confederate victory. And then the decision was made to advance into the North, to take the war to the North. And as our panel discussed earlier today, the idea was that Lee's army going into Pennsylvania was an army of looters, if you will, foragers. They were going in there. They were widely separated on widely separated avenues of approach to give the Army the maximum capability to punish the North, to do to the North what they were doing to the South in Northern Virginia, to give Virginia a break, basically. If we can win a battle, we can keep the North at bay. The media engagement that Kevin describes is the worst possible thing that could happen for an infantry force, is to run into the main force of your enemy without knowledge. And so the idea that General Stuart had left the Army, did not follow Lee's direction to guard the right flank of...
Excuse me, Steve. General Stuart was a cavalry commander for the South.
So he has taken his 4 brigades of cavalry and has disappeared somewhere into Maryland, Pennsylvania. So he literally, General Lee is surprised by this action that Kevin has just described. And he reacts, as Kevin said, he reacts very quickly, take advantage of the situation he's given, and he attacks and drives 2 Union Corps back onto what becomes the ground that you're all familiar with. On the second day of the battle, perhaps the bloodiest day of the battle, the main action starts relatively late in the day for a number of reasons. One, the idea that the intent of Robert E. Lee is to attack in concert on the extreme right flank, Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill, and down south, in an attempt on one side or the other to break the Union line and roll it up from the flank. The battles take place more or less simultaneously, not more serendipitously than by design. Because of problems in finding a route down to the area of Little Round Top, down to the peach farm and the wheat field. In the south, Longstreet's corps is moving. They appear on the route they're taking, it appears they're going to be seen, so they have to double back and take another route to come back. So further delays the attack until nearly very, very late in the afternoon, very, very late. So by the time they're starting to attack after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's going to be dark soon. The advantage that they have in this part is that one of the Union commanders, General Sickles, has moved forward and not told his commander, General Meade. So he's taken and put the entire Federal position at risk. That's the place where Longstreet attacks. That corps is handled very roughly and driven back. The battle at Little Round Top, the battle at Round Top, all those battles occur. Joshua Chamberlain and those brigades that drive the Alabama troops off of Little Round Top and that settled the position in the South for the final day. All of those battles occur on this second day in the South. On the north end of the battlefield, the right side, Culp's Hill, because of the battles in the South, the Union General Meade has pulled forces from that area and given them to reinforce here. One of those units that leaves its entrenchments, and when the Confederates attack, they seize those entrenchments. But they're held in place by a very powerful and significant Union action with very small forces against very large forces. So at the end of the second day, what you find is the traditional fishhook that you all remember from school. The Union lines going north from Little Round Top, around Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and back. And that's the end of the day on the second day. That evening, General Lee will plan another attack in concert where he intends to take fresh forces coming up. And remember that all these Confederate forces had been scattered all over to do the foraging, the looting, if you will, of Pennsylvania. They're still coming into the battle on the afternoon of the 2nd. They're still being collected, if you will, to concentrated. So with that set up, Battle of Day 3.
General Pickett shows up with his division after a long march. Jeb Stuart, the Confederate cavalry commander, finally comes back. And the attack that Steve was describing again was an attempt to, and you know, as the story is told, there was an attack in the north, there was an attack in the south, the center must be weak, therefore we'll attack there. It was a little bit more than that because there was an action again on the right, on the Union right, the Confederate left, Culp's Hill again, to at least try to draw off more forces from the center to enable a penetration in the center by Pickett's fresh division and not too badly used from the first day, sort of a division minus and a full division from another Confederate corps, all under the command of Longstreet, the Confederate corps commander who's in charge of this fight. There's a long cannonade. There's delay in launching the battle. Does it start in the morning? Should it get underway then? And we talked about why it didn't happen during the afternoon. Suffice to say, though, this attack is launched when it is launched after a very long cannonade. Pickett, Trimble, and Pettigrew's divisions attack across roughly 1,600 meters, about a mile, open ground. Lots of artillery fire. They're held up by the undulating ground and some fences that are there, but they actually do get to the center part of the Union line. There is a moment when it might have been possible for a penetration, but the attack culminates there. And the Union forces defeat the Confederates in the center. The Confederates retreat. And that's the way the day ends, with a lot of losses on both sides, but the Union holding the ground, thus victorious. There is no immediate counterattack for which the Union commander Meade is criticized. The criticism builds over the years after the war ends. So it's now battles of reputation among general officers, reputations of regiments. But at that moment on that day, that was a significant victory for George Meade, the Union, and the Army of the Potomac. Lee gathers his forces. It rains on the 4th, and they begin the long and painful withdrawal back across the Potomac. There's a half-hearted pursuit. The cavalry actions on the part of the Union tried their best to disrupt the withdrawal, but Lee, at the end of that period, is successful in withdrawing the bulk of the remnants of the Army of Northern Virginia. George Meade takes the Army of the Potomac back across the Potomac, and they're really back where they started, and the war lasts 2 more years.
Okay, we're going to go to our 7 decisions after one more.
Is that okay?
This is excellent. Okay. We're going to go to our 7 decisions after one more question, but we found out, one of the things that I found fascinating about the discussion this afternoon is that a lot of people are informed by the book The Killer Angels by Shara or by the movie Gettysburg, which is based on that. And a lot of the facts are essentially correct, but essentially are played up, are focused on, to the complete lack of focus on other things. And so I'm kind of curious, Kevin, Steve, what are some of the decisions that people may have come tonight thinking, oh, that's got to be one of the 7 that gets on there? There are 2 portrayed in the movie, I think, and then there's one that is not, I don't recall, as portrayed in the movie. So let's talk
about
it.
the one of mine that didn't make the list.
First Minnesota, yeah, that's one that may not be quite as well known.
And again, this was a wonderful process. Give and take among professionals, and yeah, I did have to put a good idea cutoff date because I owed these to Bill so that he can develop the rest of the program. A wonderful process. And again, this is just from Kevin Benson's readings, and I am not a Civil War historian as my colleagues are, but I have spent a fair amount of time over my Army career and subsequent to that studying this significant part of American history. I'm sure one of them was because Michael Shara's book was very popular, and as Ethan said, everybody wants to buy the Joshua Chamberlain t-shirt at Gettysburg at the Gift Center. But the action of the 20th Maine on a little round top and the bayonet charge that swept the Confederates from the field We discussed that this afternoon, but again, among the consensus, that wasn't one of the critical decisions that played heavily in the totality of the 3 days. Again, that was the consensus. We discussed whether or not Buford's decision to recognize that there was good ground on the ridge lines in front of Gettysburg, and he would delay the Confederate forces there and convince Reynolds and Meade that this is good ground and this is where we fight. And again, we went back and forth, and this is really the expectation of what a good cavalry commander is supposed to do. So, okay, that's just an incident upon which others build. My personal favorite, and again, this is just from study, and again, why? It's the action of a very small regiment, the 1st Minnesota, on the 2nd day of the battle, as Steve so well described, and we talked in length about this afternoon. Sickles' corps is badly handled, roughly handled. And here come the Confederates, and they're screaming up in some disorder, some good order. The issue is in doubt. A corps commander, Winfield Scott Hancock, is on the scene and sees that there is but a Union regiment that has arrived. Here come the Confederates. Hancock, a very bright man, one who continued to study his profession after he left the military academy, recognizes that he has to buy time. And how does one buy time in the Civil War? Colonel commanding, 1st Minnesota, sir, go and take those colors. And the colonel commanding, and Steve and I, when we were young men going to school together, we walked that ground, and I could instantly flash back to that, thinking, here I am, colonel commanding, I've got less than 500 soldiers, and my corps commander has just told me to attack into about 5,000 or 6,000, and I know it's to buy time for the rest of the Union forces to come, and I don't hesitate.
And what was the result, Kevin?
47 men came back.
Out of how many?
A little less than 500.
Okay. Any other decisions, gentlemen, that didn't make the list?
Do you remember? I think we had pretty good consensus over all the rest of them, didn't we?
Okay. Okay. Let's go to the decisions. Now, some of you are sitting out there reading your program, and you're saying, why didn't you put the 7 decisions in the program? I was right, wasn't I? Well, it's because if we did that, you'd be reading the program instead of listening to the experts. So you don't have to write them down, though. We have a list for you that you can pick up on your way out, okay? So we're trying to think ahead a little bit here. So 7 decisions. We're going to count them down backwards, okay? So we're going to start with the 7th most critical decision at Gettysburg. The 7th most critical decision was Lee's decision to invade the North. And for our expert commentary, we're going to go to Professor Ginny Weber. Ginny?
Good evening. Good evening. Thanks for coming out. Is this on?
Apparently not.
Okay. Can you
No,
hear me
no,
now?
no. We got to have the mic on. You
We
want
have
to
to
flip
have
the
the mic.
switch?
Okay. How about that?
Speak into it.
Okay.
Okay.
All
good.
right.
Thank you.
Great. I think I could project to the back of the room, but it really would have tried my voice. So
We
this
wouldn't
is
make
better.
the video either. So.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. Well, anyway, thank you all for coming out tonight. It's good to see you. And Steve set up part of this for me already. Lee makes the decision to come north after this tremendous victory that he had had at Chancellorsville in May of 1863. He was outnumbered by about 2-1. He had divided his army into 3, and yet he had prevailed over this overwhelming force. It was a tremendous victory for him. So Lee now has come to believe that his troops are invincible. And his troops have come to believe that they are invincible as long as Lee is their general. So there's a great deal of confidence in this army. That's one piece of it. Second piece is that the Union and Confederate armies have been moving back and forth and back and forth and back and forth across northern Virginia by this time for really 2 years, the better part of 2 years. And northern Virginia is pretty wiped out in terms of things that an army would need, in terms of crops, in terms of fuel, wood, in terms, to a lesser degree, of livestock. The armies have used all this up. The Union forces are pretty well supplied. Less true for the Confederate forces, which are having difficulties already in feeding the troops complete rations, keeping them clothed, keeping them shod. And Lee thinks that if he takes his army up into the north, at least they'll be able to eat better for some period of time, however long he's in the north. Where's he going? We don't know. He never said. That is one of the mysteries of the ages, and we just don't know. The other thing that Lee is looking at is the political situation in the North. I think that one thing that people often overlook about Lee is he is extremely astute politically. And what he understands is that there is a great deal of dissent in the North. And the summer before, already, things had gotten so bad and so ugly for the Union forces, particularly in the East, that there were a lot of people in the North who were ready to throw in the towel on the war. Since then, you have the very divisive measure of the Emancipation Proclamation and the equally divisive measure of a draft law in the North. Lee is hoping to capitalize on all of this, and he's hoping that with a significant victory in the North, on Northern territory, that he can knock the props out from under Northern civilian will and force some sort of a resolution to the war one way or the other. And P.S., you have important gubernatorial elections coming up in the fall in Ohio and Pennsylvania. So this is what, these factors are all what brings him to the North and leads his army to accidentally bump into the Army of the Potomac.
Okay. Thank you, Jenny. Sixth most critical decision. Reynolds' decision to fight at Gettysburg. Kevin, Steve, what are your thoughts on this decision, and what other options were in play?
Go ahead.
Reynolds' decision to fight. Reynolds is a very experienced commander. He's not only commanding his corps, he's actually commanding a wing, which is how Meade, wing meaning he had 3 corps together. The 9 corps of the federal forces are divided into 3 wings, commanded by a senior corps commander within each wing. He's given essentially authority to go forward and to fight, develop the fight as it comes forward. Meade's idea is to fight farther south, closer to his line of supply, to a position he feels is very strong south of Gettysburg. Reynolds, when he encounters the infantry of the Confederate Army, decides to fight and find good ground to do that fight on. Essentially, he commits the Army of the Potomac to fight on ground that this commander is going to choose. It is, in fact, not what General Meade intended. But when General Meade discovers that he's done this, General Meade immediately comes forward, concurs in the decision, and brings the Army of the Potomac forward. So in terms of a commander given responsibility for a large part of the 1/3 essentially of the Union Army of the Potomac, it appears that Reynolds makes not only a good decision, but he makes the right decision based on what he finds on the ground. And Meade, in turn, supports him in that decision.
And I think this is why, when we reached consensus, that the decision that Brigadier General Buford, who's the cavalry commander, took, recognizing good ground, I'm in possession of good ground, I will hold, that's why that really didn't rise to the level, as my colleagues pointed out, that it really took the act of the wing commander, General Reynolds, to recognize that this in fact was good ground, this was the ground on which we should fight a battle, and that committed the significant portion of the Union Army, thus the Army commander validating that decision and concentrating the Union Army on that piece of ground. So that made a great deal of sense as I reflected on it, the wisdom of our crowd here. But that's a tremendous decision that really precipitated the battle itself. As Jenny pointed out, this didn't happen by accident. There were decisions taken, and that's why this decision rose to that level, I believe.
Okay. We're going to go to the fifth most important decision, and that was Ewell's decision not to attack Cemetery Hill or seize Culp's Hill.
Ewell is an important character in this drama because, as you recall, if you don't recall, the Stonewall Jackson dies at Chancellorsville. Stonewall Jackson is Lee's most dependable or most depended upon commander in terms of his maneuver. He mourns the loss of Jackson. The Army mourns the loss of Jackson. Ewell takes his part, the reorganized corps. Ewell's action, as he moves into Virginia, he leads the Army into Pennsylvania. He is given the direction to advance, forage, loot as much of Pennsylvania as you can, send it back to the Army, and get to Harrisburg if you can. If you imagine the geography now of this part of Pennsylvania, if you put Gettysburg in the center and you see that Ewell traveled through Gettysburg, he would go up to the Susquehanna River to a town called York where there's a bridge, and off to his left is Carlisle and then Harrisburg. When he gets to York on about the 28th of June, the Federals burn the bridge, so he doesn't cross it. He intends to cross that bridge and burn and destroy parts of the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad, the main railroad between east and west in that part of the United States. They burn it. He gets word at the same time that he's got forces now in Carlisle. He's 3 or 4 miles from Harrisburg, and he intends to go and occupy Harrisburg. And he's told Lee has information that the Union Army is concentrating against him in the South, and turns him around. Ewell, up to this point, has been the equal of Jackson. He's moved faster, farther, harder than anybody else. He's collected more cattle, more stuff stolen from Pennsylvania.
Bought with Confederate money.
Bought with Confederate. Same, stolen, bought with Confederate money. Here, I'll sign it for you. You can give that to them and tell them I took it. So Ewell, at this point, he is what Lee would have expected of Jackson. When he turns around and heads south now, and the battle is occurring to the west of Gettysburg, the battle we talked about on the first day, Reynolds, 1st Corps, 11th Corps, are fighting above, north, and to the west of Gettysburg. Ewell is essentially, he is concentrated. He has a large force coming to them. He attacks and pushes the 11th Corps all the way back to Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill, forcing 1st Corps also to return to the Cemetery Hill area. It's dark when he does this. Now, the light is gone. He's pushed the Union. The Union has moved up what is essentially a route. They stopped on the top of Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill. Ewell decides not to attack. Although Lee gives him the opportunity to, He says, take Culp's Hill if you can, essentially. Ewell declines. That decision in itself may have cost the Confederates a victory at Gettysburg. Many reasons occur for that may have occurred for that. It's dark. His forces have come off of open ground through Gettysburg, meaning they're no longer in a formation that you can recognize. His units are mingled and mixed together. The Union forces are in no better shape up on top of the hill. And it's also dark. And fighting at night is very rarely done in the Civil War. So at the end of the day, nighttime has fallen. The Confederates are below Culp's Hill. The Union is on top. He makes a decision that many people believe Jackson would not have made. Many people believe Jackson would have continued on. When you have them routed, attack. And don't let up until you've beaten them. And to lose that high ground to the Union forces was something that many believe that Jackson would have done. And that Ewell had the authority to do, and perhaps was expected by Lee to do so, but did not.
Did you want to add anything, Kevin?
Well, and it must have been a heck of a thing to have the ghost of Stonewall Jackson riding next to you, with you're in command of some of the elements of his corps. So folks are looking up at you, expecting you to be Jackson, and you are not Jackson. But there is that pressure, but he is the corps commander. They've marched a long way. He's tired. His troops are tired. They've fought a battle. They've been victorious. It's night. I mean, I can see why he wouldn't want to do that. That being attack, take Cemetery Hill, take Culp's Hill, especially Cemetery because it was flat, good place for artillery, the artillery of the time. But there must have been enormous pressure on this man and high expectations, and it possibly at that moment, it takes an element of ruthlessness. Stonewall Jackson was pretty ruthless. Drive his people to drive the enemy, the Union forces. And I'm not sure that he had that element of ruthlessness. Certainly he was an intelligent man. Certainly he was a courageous man. But at that moment, that final drive to take the chance of, I know my troops are disorganized, I know they're tired, but we're going to make one more effort and continue to drive the Union forces away. We can't get inside the man's head. It's been 150 years, but I can see why he wouldn't have taken that decision. New to command, fought some minor battles on the way up, but this is a big fight with the Army of the Potomac, his foe for the past few years. So caution prevailed.
And it was discussed, I believe this afternoon, correct me if I'm wrong, that it wasn't a foregone conclusion that if he had tried
That's true.
to succeed, that he would have.
Absolutely. I really can't fault him. He had a lot to live up to, but he took the decision. He was the commander on the scene. His instructions said, if possible or if practicable. If he had that latitude, my higher commander tells me it is within my purview to take the decision, well, then I'm going to take the decision. And my instincts tell me my troops have done enough, therefore it's enough. And who knows what's on the other side of that hill.
Okay. The fourth most critical decision is Sickles' decision to move forward into the peach orchard and the wheat field. And for commentary on that, Dr. Ethan Rayfuse. Ethan?
Thank you. Coming after the discussion of Dick Ewell, another thing to keep consideration, Gettysburg, it was his first return to command since August of '62. At the Battle of Second Manassas, he was on one knee watching the fighting go on. And what happened was a bullet entered his kneecap and then drilled down through his lower leg, and that necessitated its amputation. So he was out of action for a while. But he also managed, while being out of action, to marry the love of his life, Lacinka Brown. And it was sensed that after the marriage, Ewell was so wrapped up in puppy love that he couldn't run things. And the joke was, during the period he was out of action, he lost a leg, gained a wife, and the Confederacy was the worse for both developments. Now, the subject I'm talking about, the decision I've been given is Dan Sickles. Something that I've been told I have 3 to 5 minutes on a subject that a book has been written on it called A Caspian Sea of Ink. I have 3 to 5 minutes. Let me first just set the situation for you. It is July the 2nd, 1863, the second day of the battle. Okay, if you need to close your eyes and visualize, sort of imagine the situation. At the top, upper right, you have, I'll do it over here, reverse, you have Culp's Hill, okay? And then you move over in this direction, you have what's called Cemetery Hill. And then you go south, it's just called Cemetery Ridge. At the south end of it, you've got 2 rises, one called Little Round Top, the other called Round Top. That is the Union position for July the 2nd. The Confederate position essentially parallels it, but on a much longer length, okay? Dan Sickles' job was he commanded the 3rd Corps. Armies at this time were divided into corps were divided into divisions into brigades. Dan Sickles commanded the 3rd Corps, and he was assigned responsibility for the southern part of the field by General George Meade, the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Now, when Meade showed up on midnight the night before, he arrived at Cemetery Hill, conducted reconnaissance, and was working through his options. The basic problem he's facing is his entire army's not up. By the time midnight arrives, he still has 2 corps on the way to the battlefield. He thinks about attacking in the morning, but he's dissuaded by a reconnaissance and a desire to have everything concentrated to stay on the defensive for the day. He's going to be very, very concerned about his southern flank. Okay, there's a lot of talk about Longstreet proposes to Lee marching around the southern federal flank. And of course, the flanks on any army are going to be a very, very sensitive position. So Sickles is given command of the southern part of the field, and he's assigned responsibility for defending Round Top, Little Round Top, which is a cleared up. Round Top's not of much military value because it's very wooded, but Little Round Top has recently been cleared, so it's a very open hill, and so it's very important that you hold that field. So Sickles is assigned to command that part of the field. And what happens is Sickles arrives in his designated position on the southern end of Cemetery Ridge, and he finds it's very low ground. It's the lowest part of the ridge between the Round Tops and Cemetery Hill. And when he looks west in the direction which the Confederates are assumed to be coming from, he sees a much better, higher piece of ground on which there is a peach orchard. This is the famous peach orchard position. Now, in the previous battle at Chancellorsville, Dan Sickles had held a wonderful position for artillery called Hazel Grove. He had been ordered off Hazel Grove on the morning of one of the days of the battle, seen the Confederates put artillery up there, and his corps had taken a severe beating. So Sickles looks out, and he wants to occupy that high ground out front. And it's one of the things, going to the battlefield is very, very valuable, particularly the 2 different battlefields, because Terry and myself have been both to Gettysburg and to Hazel Grove. You look from Hazel Grove to the position Sickles had to fall back to, and then you have that in your mental picture when you stand at the peach orchard, and you look toward the position that Sickles was assigned. You very much understand Sickles' thinking, why he would want this position, this piece of high ground. Problem is, he doesn't have enough force in his command. He has the 3rd Corps, which consists of 2 divisions, and there's not enough force to occupy the peach orchard and to extend the line long enough to cover the 2 Round Tops. Okay? So he asks for permission. He writes to headquarters asking for permission to do this. Meade sends his son, who's on his staff, out there to tell him, this is not what you hold the position you were given. Sickles writes back again. Henry Hunt, the Army's chief of artillery, comes to Sickles' position. Sickles points him towards the peach orchard, and Hunt agrees from his professional standpoint that it is better ground. So Sickles says, can I have authority to go occupy it? Hunt says, knowing that the Army commander, that's not what the Army commander wants, says, not on my authority. And then shortly after that, and this is often overlooked, is that to the left of Sickles' position, Buford's cavalry had been there to guard the southern flank. But during the day, Meade gives its authority to head further south, and so Sickles sees his cavalry leave. He's nervous about this position out in front, and he goes and he occupies this piece of ground. But again, he doesn't have enough force to hold it, and consequently, his Third Corps is going to take a very, very bad beating. His position at the Peach Orchard is going to be crushed, and it's only by the very timely arrival of reinforcements that the Federals are able to hold on to Little Round Top. Sickles is wounded badly. His leg necessitates amputation, and then there's a big hole in the Federal line that Winfield Scott Hancock's got to pull forces from other parts of the Union line to plug up to make up for Sickles' mistake. Now, it's controversial because after Sickles gets wounded, his first stop after the hospital is to Washington, D.C. to explain what he did. Get his story in first, okay? And the story he comes up with is that George Meade was going to retreat on the second day of July. And only by occupying this high ground and forcing the Confederates to initiate the battle, I put Meade in a position where he could not retreat the way he wanted to. Of course, this is going to create the Caspian Sea of ink. Meade and his partisans are going to argue against this. Sickles and his partisans are going to argue for it. And this is going to be an ongoing argument in history to this day over Sickles' performance versus Meade's performance. And it comes down to basic questions that we wrestle with when we teach Army officers to Staff College. The question of an on-the-ground commander's perception of a situation and how that fits into the overall commander's intent for what he wants done that day. And what happens when those two are in conflict? How much initiative should the subordinate commander be allowed to? These are the larger questions that are good to wrestle with the subject, but they get wrapped up in the personalities, which is something that inevitably happens in much of Civil War history. Now, that wasn't a Caspian Sea of ink, but I think that was more than 3 to 5 minutes, and we will leave the wrestling with this question, if there is any, to a Q&A afterward. Thank you.
Bravo.
Thank you, Ethan. Our third most important decision at Gettysburg was Stuart's decision to ride east of the Army of the Potomac, missing the first day of Gettysburg, in effect, leaving Lee blind. Talk about that, gentlemen.
I'm going to defer that question to my cavalry commander next door here.
Before Gettysburg, the Army of Northern Virginia holds a series of grand reviews, getting ready to go, and so Lee can see his troops. And one of the outfits, of course, that he witnesses is his cavalry. And shortly after this grand review, it's a marvelous success. Ladies faint, men grow weak with admiration. The Union cavalry attacks the Confederate cavalry. Battle at Brandy Station. And again, we had a marvelous talk about this. And again, Jenny and Deb brought up the points this afternoon that it's probably a draw. Actually, it's probably a victory for the Confederates, because infantry comes up and the Union cavalry leaves. The Union cavalry commander sort of blows it out of proportion, thumping his chest and saying he whipped the Confederates. But what really happens is Jeb Stuart gets pilloried in the Confederate press. And that kind of hurts my feelings, because I'm, after all, the dashing cavalier of the South, and everything I touch turns to gold, and I've completely discombobulated Union cavalry for the entire war. And here, boy, these guys kind of fought me to a draw, really took me by surprise, which really pained him. So to regain his, and again, is there controversy over this? Of course there is, because this is history. All these guys are dead, and so we just can read reports and read other people's work and try to determine what happens. He is supposed to guard the right flank of the Army of Northern Virginia, but he can interpret his orders such that he feels he can do this by riding around the Union Army again. And so he does. Now, he does leave cavalry with the Army of Northern Virginia. But how these guys are used is not centrally controlled. There are some out in the west, some go with Ewell going north, but they're not coming back and painting the picture for Robert Lee, as he was accustomed to receiving, by and large, from Jeb Stuart. Stuart, in an attempt to regain his reputation, and again, this is in the myths of how this battle was lost in the South, but the fact is he does right away, and more importantly, loses contact not only with the Union Army, but with the Army of Northern Virginia. He does not know where they are, so he's got to find them to get back. And he has some brushes with Union trains where he takes a whole bunch of wagons and decides to keep those because that's booty, and that's a good thing. I can come back and show I've got something. He brushes into some Union cavalry farther to the north, but he's still trying to find the Army of Northern Virginia. And again, Steve and I were talking about this. The thing that really have to bear in mind is his soldiers, his troopers are tired, but they're riding animals who are also tired. And they're still on the march. So he's wearing out not only his troopers, but his animals, which is his prime means of mobility. You know, the mobility differential over infantry is you can get somewhere faster on a horse. But you have to take care of them. So the horses are tired, his men are tired. When he finally gets back to the Army of Northern Virginia, evening of the 2nd of July, what kind of a force does he give Lee that Lee can use? It's a tired force. They haven't had too many fights, but they're exhausted. They've not provided any intelligence. As Steve and you've heard it say, this battle began with a meeting engagement because we're out there kind of, where's the bad guy? Oh, now we found him, we can fight. And the cavalry was absent. The cavalry at the time, both north and south, they weren't like Napoleonic cavalry with light and heavy and sustain themselves over long periods of time and be the decisive arm. That's the infantry and the artillery in our Civil War. And the cavalry is really a light force that can do screening, it can do reconnaissance. Not much reconnaissance, but more preventing other folks from finding your force. And so the decision to widely interpret or broadly interpret his mission from Robert Lee really does take an essential element of what was the combined arms team of cavalry, infantry, artillery in the Civil War away from Lee. And Lee has to fight blind to a certain extent. Although I've not really satisfied it in my mind, why didn't he make use of the cavalry that he had, he being Lee? But that's probably in a book I haven't read yet.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is that if you put yourself or try to put yourself in the mind of Robert E. Lee, and you set this army in motion, and you set this cavalry force on your flank, primarily for the purpose of knowing where and when you're going to make contact with the Union Army. The entire construct of this movement is intended so that when the cavalry makes contact, you have time to concentrate your army. Because the whole focus of this Civil War tactic is to get your army concentrated faster than he can and destroy him as quickly as you can in detail if you can. And so we talked earlier about the first day, the meeting engagement on the first day is the worst possible surprise to your construct that you have created for this event. And suddenly you know where all of your forces are scattered all over Pennsylvania, and suddenly you have the Union Army where you didn't expect them, where you didn't want them, and you're not concentrated. And that belongs to Jeb Stuart, principally, but also somewhat to Robert Lee in not using the brigades that were left to do any of that. So it is a surprise that he runs into infantry versus infantry. And so it is a very powerful difficulty for Lee. Now, good on Lee. He immediately reacts and does what Lee does on that first day, attack. I've got something, I got part of them, go after it. And then concentrate the army while you're doing it. But the bottom line is Lee, that's not what Lee wanted to do. Lee wanted to find them, concentrate his army, and then defeat them.
Okay. The second most critical decision at Gettysburg was Lee's decision to order Picketts Charge. And for our commentary on that, Professor, actually Dr. Deb Shepard. Deb?
Hi, everyone. Good to see you.
Speak into the mic,
Closer to
Deb.
the mic, Deb.
Good to see you here. I was privileged to be a part of a staff ride to Gettysburg in 2007. And we were additionally privileged to have a historian who has studied Gettysburg extensively join us. That historian was Carol Reardon. And I want to begin our discussion of Picketts Charge with a few words from her book entitled Picketts Charge in History and Memory. So all this is quoted. A few days after he survived Picketts Charge, Private William H. Jones of the 19th Virginia summed up his entire experience in the awful battle at Gettysburg with the very succinct comment, "It was the most awful battle that I have ever been in." Nearly a century later, chronicler George Stewart began his story of the day's events with a far more effusive statement. If we grant, as many would be ready to do, that the Civil War furnishes the great dramatic episode of the history of the United States, and that Gettysburg provides the climax of the war, then the climax of the climax, the central moment of American history, must be Picketts Charge. End quote. A question for us then is this: what critical decision or decisions led to this central moment? Late on July 2nd, both Meade and Lee had tough decisions ahead of them. Meade called his officers together for a council of war, and mostly what he wanted to know from them is, what do you want to do? His idea was to retreat and regroup at Pipeline Creek, where he originally wanted to fight, but he didn't know what his officers thought. And at the end of the meeting, they decided they were going to stay and they were going to fight. Gibbon was there, and Meade actually told him he thought Lee would attack the center where Gibbon would be the next day. Lee's decision was much more difficult, and he did not consult his officers. He had options. He could disengage and end the battle. He could wait for Meade to make a move. He could implement Longstreet's idea of flanking Meade's left. He rejected all these options because none would lead to the victory he sought, the victory he came to Pennsylvania for in the first place. Disengaging would put him in a worse position and condition than before the campaign. Waiting on Meade meant going on the defensive, and Lee believed he needed offense to win this. Longstreet's idea, even if successful, and that's debated, would place him between Meade's army and Washington, but it would not necessarily result in an end to the battle, let alone a victory. Lee decided to attack both ends of Meade's army, with Longstreet's end kind of sidling toward the center, simultaneously at daybreak. Longstreet would renew his assault on the Union left with a slide to the center, and Ewell would resume his attack on Culp's Hill. Lee visited Longstreet's headquarters at 4:30 in the morning and found that Longstreet had done nothing to prepare for the orders he'd been given. Pickett, whom he should have called up hours ago, was still miles away. Longstreet was convinced Lee's plan would lead to disaster and still hoped to convince him to flank Meade. Ewell was ready. So was the 12th Union Corps, and it opened an artillery barrage on Ewell at 4:30. When Lee heard the artillery, he knew that he probably needed a new plan. He ordered Longstreet to bring up Pickett's 3 fresh divisions. He only had 3 of his 5, but they were all fresh, and they had 5 brigades each. Virginians, and they would attack the Union center. Hill's Corps would bolster Longstreet's numbers with 6 extra brigades. Longstreet claimed it would take at least 30,000 for the attack to succeed. He would have around 11,000. Law and McLaws, who were really too ragged and tired from earlier fighting to join in, they would anchor the Confederate right where they already were and pin down Union defenders on Little Round Top. All 5 brigades of Anderson's division would provide support. Rhodes's 3 brigades just to the left would join in when Rhodes saw fit. Lee also planned for artillery from the high ground on the Peach Orchard that we've already talked about to blast and demoralize Union artillery and soldiers. Then Pickett would spearhead the assault. Lee, I think, expected that he could succeed. He had abundant confidence in his men, as we've already noted. In addition, Wright's brigade of 1,500 Georgians had briefly crested that center the day before with only 1 brigade. Today, Lee would send 9 with the rest of the army in support. And we'll see what happens after that.
Thank you, Deb. And our group of experts decided that the most important decision made at Gettysburg was Meade's decision not to pursue Lee. And we're going to call on Dr. Terry Beckenbaugh to comment on that. Terry?
Thank you, Bill. Can everybody hear me? After I kind of started to look at this again, I realized I probably shouldn't have phrased it Meade's decision not to pursue Lee after Gettysburg. I probably should have phrased it Meade's decision not to pursue Lee vigorously after Gettysburg. He did pursue Lee. The question is, how vigorously did he pursue him? And there's several different questions here. Like the first question is, after Picketts Charge failed, and if you've seen the movie Gettysburg, when they start yelling, Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg, why didn't they attack right then? Well, people told Meade to attack. Winfield Scott Hancock, 2nd Corps commander, tells Meade, go. This is the time to go. Alfred Pleasanton specifically told Meade, this is your chance to be immortalized like the Duke of Wellington at Waterloo. The problem was Meade was not the Duke of Wellington. Now, that's also being somewhat harsh on Meade, although I think it is fair. Meade did have some disadvantages. Meade didn't have the Prussian army nearby like Wellington had at Waterloo. Meade had used most of the 5th and part of the 6th Corps to patch holes on July 2nd. So really he doesn't have a big reserve. It will be mostly 6th Corps. And of course, you're not talking about, that's Uncle John, Ethan. Uncle John Sedgwick was the 6th Corps commander. We're not talking about Lightning Jones here. And furthermore, Meade is a cautious man by nature. He'd only been put in command on the 28th of June. Why risk it? Why blow it? And that may be part of Meade's problem. Instead of, we can possibly end the war and bag them here, Meade says, why blow it? However, despite all that, I think you can make a decent case that Meade was justified in not counterattacking the immediate aftermath of Pickett's Charge. His army had taken a beating, just like the Confederates. He did have more troops available, but again, they were very disorganized. So even if you accept that would have been easier, it would not have been easy, it's understandable. The better question now is that when Lee does start retreating on the afternoon of July 4th, why doesn't Meade pursue very vigorously? Well, certainly Lee's vulnerable at this juncture. The Army of Northern Virginia had lost over 20,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, close to 1/3 of its overall strength. Lee had a 17-mile-long wagon train full of wounded and supplies. They had to traverse back through Cashtown, Fairfield, and Monterey to get to the eastern side of the Cumberland Valley of South Mountain, and then travel 50-plus miles down to the Potomac River. And with that kind of a baggage train, Lee is not moving at lightning speed. Furthermore, Meade does not begin his pursuit, at least in earnest, until July 5th. Yes, he does send cavalry after Lee. But instead of going after trying to cut inside at Fairfield, which is to the southwest of Gettysburg, Meade decides to go south to Frederick and then try and get over to the Williamsport, Maryland, where the Potomac River is generally forded. Now, Meade did send cavalry, and the cavalry did act aggressively. For cavalry under the Brigadier General John Buford, the 1st Cavalry Division went south to Westminster and then to Williamsport, where on July 6th it destroyed bridges over the Potomac River, which is going to cause problems for Lee later. Brigadier General Judson Kilpatrick of the 3rd Cavalry Division, who his men called Kill Cavalry because he was so careless of his own men's lives, he followed the Confederates and attacked wagon trains bearing wounded and supplies through Fairfield. Brigadier General David McMurtry Gregg of the 2nd Cavalry Division followed the Confederates through Cashtown Pass, which is today modern-day US 30 going towards, or well, roughly modern-day US 30 going towards Chambersburg. Now, even though we certainly criticize Jeb Stuart, the Confederate cavalry commander, for his absence, Stuart does deserve credit here because he does a phenomenal job of trying to shield Stuart and John Imboden, do a phenomenal job of shielding Lee's army from the Federal cavalry. Yes, there are some sharp engagements, and yes, the Confederate cavalry is exhausted, but Stuart and Lee have managed to combine to let the Army of Virginia get back to Williamsport, Maryland. By late afternoon of July 5th, the head of Lee's long wagon train is in Williamsport, Maryland. By July 11th, the bulk of the rest of the Army of Northern Virginia is safely dug in behind strong fortifications around the fort at Williamsport, Maryland. Now, this is going to make it very difficult. These fortifications, there's debate as to how strong the fortifications were. For the most part, the fortifications appear to have been very strong. Had the Federals attacked these fortifications, that would have been very problematic for Meade to make a breakthrough. So, the cavalry pursuit was fairly vigorous. Why wasn't the infantry follow-up nearly as vigorous? Well, first off, Meade holds a council of war on the night of July 4th. And note, holding councils of war is usually an excuse for a commander to not attack. And the vote among the leading officers is 5-3 to sit tight and see what the Confederates are going to do for 24 hours. It also doesn't help that it begins to rain really hard. Back home where I grew up about half an hour from Gettysburg, we call those gully washers. I don't know if they use that term out here in Kansas, but you get a good gully washer, and remember, most of these roads are mud, and it's going to be very difficult to move with any kind of speed. So you have both sides dealing with mud. Plus, even though the Army of the Potomac was victorious, they had over 23,000 casualties as well, so they had taken a beating. Another problem the Federals have is that in the shuffling on the 2nd, Meade has to put all those units back with their coherent, with their organic elements. So it's going to take some time. And I think finally, one of the things you have to remember is that Meade has only been in command for 6 days at this point. 6 days. So why squander this victory? Well, as Dr. Rayfuse mentioned, there's a lot of debate about this. In one of the books out front, Alan Guelzo's book, Gettysburg, The Last Invasion, to say that Guelzo is harsh on Meade is probably being an understatement. Okay, he's very, very harsh on Meade. He said it would have been difficult, but great generals, like the Duke of Wellington, ask difficult things from their troops. But Guelzo argues that possibly Meade was a secret McClellanite, a Democrat who was not in favor of persecuting the war to its vigorous end, that he wanted possibly a negotiated settlement. That's an awful lot to lay on Meade's legacy. If I was in the jury after reading that book, I'd say there's enough evidence to indict. I don't think there's enough to convict. Stephen Sears' book, Gettysburg, in 2004, is nowhere near as harsh. He says that Meade could have been more aggressive, but it probably wouldn't have mattered. He also points out that Meade's officer corps, much like Lee's, had also been destroyed. The two best corps commanders, Hancock had been wounded, and John Reynolds on the First Corps had been killed. So Meade is a little reluctant to attempt a vigorous pursuit and attack with untried and untested corps commanders. Edwin Connington in the classic The Gettysburg Campaign, which I still believe is the best operational history of the campaign, written in 1968, says that Meade was entirely reactive. Lincoln had told Meade to cover Washington and Baltimore, and he criticized Meade for making two cautious assumptions. For one example, Meade did not think of sending cavalry units to seize the pass around Fairfield and Monterey to the southwest of Gettysburg. He had assumed that Lee had strongly fortified these things because Lee is brilliant and never makes a mistake. Well, guess what? Lee didn't have them fortified. Of course, as an armchair general, I can say that, and so can Coddington. But I think the thing you have to understand is that Civil War armies are incredibly resilient. There's only a couple times in the entire war where a Civil War army is destroyed in the field. Grant destroyed three of them. He destroyed one when he captured Fort Donelson. He destroyed one at Vicksburg, and of course he destroys Lee's army when he captures it at the very end of the war. Otherwise, it rarely happens in an open battle. I guess the closest thing is maybe you could argue that that John Bell Hood's army is destroyed by General George Thomas at the Battle of Nashville right at the end of the war. But other than that, Civil War armies are really, really difficult to destroy. And I think you could argue that Lee, even though he performed poorly in the Gettysburg campaign up to Picketts Charge, he executed a very superbly rearguard action in defense. So I'm sure I'm over my time, so I will stop.
Okay. Thank you, Terry. We are going to open it up to your questions and answers now. We're going to take about 15 minutes worth. Please, only one question. Make it very brief and direct. And if you want a specific member of our group to respond, please direct it to that person. Keep your hands up, and our students will come along and find you. Quinn?
As to the Meade doing an immediate attack on Lee after Picketts Charge, I think by adding and subtracting a 23,000 casualties on a 73,000 armed force, that left 50,000 Confederates in the trees, with Meade still having to cross that same mile of open ground into fortified positions in the tree line. Why wouldn't that be considered Meade's version of the Picketts Charge if he actually undertook it?
Because he didn't do it. I know that might be a cheesy answer. Is it on now? Okay.
Yeah.
Mainly the answer I would give you is because he didn't do it. It's easy to criticize someone for something they didn't do, and you know, I tend to agree with you. It would have been, I think, problematic. Lee was already organizing a defense when Picketts Charge is streaming back the remnants. But realistically, I think that, I mean, my personal opinion is that I don't know that even if he does aggressively go after, Civil War armies are very, very difficult to destroy. He may have maybe caught a corps, maybe done some damage to a division or two. I don't think he would have annihilated Lee's army. I mean, remember when Grant captures Lee at Appomattox, Lee is down to less than, what, 26,000, 27,000 men. That's considerably less than what Lee has at Gettysburg, and the Army of the Potomac is actually much smaller than what Grant has at Appomattox as well. So I think it's a reasonable expectation to not expect him to do that.
Okay, Lexi?
Yeah, I'm interested in another decision that was made in regard to this battle, and that is the decision by Lincoln to replace Hooker with Meade 3 days before a significant battle. How do you think that might have affected the battle if Lincoln had not decided to do that?
Okay, I can take this. Go ahead. All right, the question about replacing Fighting Joe Hooker with George Gordon Meade on June 28th. We discussed this in our earlier today about the circumstances. Joe Hooker had a very, very bad relationship with Henry Halleck, who was the general-in-chief of all the Union armies. It's traced back to the time when they were both in California. Halleck was a very successful banker, political leader, and Hooker was a man down on his luck who borrowed money and didn't pay it back. That's part of the story. When Hooker takes command of the Army of the Potomac in January 63, Lincoln knows that he doesn't have a good relationship with Henry Halleck. But Hooker's really the only real person Lincoln can see to appoint to command. So to a certain extent, he gives Hooker workaround authority. You can communicate directly with me. After Chancellorsville, Hooker's stock takes a bit of a hit. And on the movement north, as Lee's army moves north, Hooker proposes marching south on the philosophy that if I go south toward Richmond, Davis will call back Robert E. Lee. Lincoln thinks that's a bad idea, and he begins to lose faith in Hooker, and then Hooker starts feuding with Halleck, and Halleck starts intervening, and Hooker complains, and Lincoln says, okay, let's make it clear. You will take orders from Halleck, and Halleck will give you orders, and you are to obey them, which very happy for Halleck because he's looking for, at some point, a reason to get rid of Hooker, as evidenced by Fighting Joe Hooker's plan, his basic idea, as he is moving north, there's the issue of the Harpers Ferry garrison, which is the Harpers Ferry, the Potomac River, the Shenandoah Valley. Lee is going north down the Shenandoah Valley toward the Potomac River, crossing the Potomac River, moving to the Hagerstown, then Cumberland Valley, west of South Mountain. Harpers Ferry is the point that is on the Potomac River where you move from Shenandoah Valley to north of the Potomac. Harpers Ferry had proven a big problem for Robert E. Lee in his last time he crossed the Potomac in September of '62. He had to detach forces to try to deal with the garrison. That enabled the Federals to catch him with his forces divided. And so what Lee decided, this time I'm not messing around with Harpers Ferry. I am just moving north. And I'm going to leave them consciously behind me in the Shenandoah Valley. Hooker thinks this is a good thing. I'll reinforce Harpers Ferry with a corps. They'll move in the Shenandoah Valley, and Robert E. Lee is going to have a very strong Federal force on his supply line through the Shenandoah Valley. But the thing is, Hooker wants control of the Harpers Ferry garrison, and the Harpers Ferry garrison is independent from his command. Hooker goes personally to Harpers Ferry to coordinate with the commander there. While he is there, a telegram arrives from Halleck to that commander, explicitly saying, Hooker is not to give orders to you, and you are not to obey orders from Hooker, even though Hooker is, by rank, the senior commander. Hooker writes back, give me authority, or this is my resignation. Halleck says, great. We know which one choice I want. And he accepts Hooker's resignation. In the orders to Meade when Meade takes command, he tells Meade, the Harpers Ferry garrison is under your control. Okay? And so what Meade does is what he does with the Harpers Ferry garrison, instead of keeping it in the Shenandoah Valley, he brings it east over to Frederick to guard his rear area. And that's why when Lee is falling back, that would have been a real problem for Lee's retreat if that Harpers Ferry garrison had been there. But because it's not there, Lee's able to get back to the strong position at Williamsport. But that has all kinds of consequences for the campaign. It would have shaped Lee's decision-making when he's fighting day-to-day at Gettysburg. It would have shaped his retreat. So it would have been very, very different if fighting Joe Hooker had been in command. Also different command relationships. Hooker's got the Army of the Potomac is a very, very personality-divided organization. There are commanders who still, and the suspicion that they do is quite valid, still have a lingering affection and loyalty for George McClellan. The Lincoln administration hates George McClellan. Okay? And Hooker figured that out and worked his way to high command by making clear, I am not George McClellan. When Hooker takes command, the McClellanites do not like him, and Hooker does not like them. One of Hooker's buddies is Dan Sickles. A McClellanite is Meade. There is a conflict built into that army that is going to shape what's going to happen at Gettysburg. So there are many consequences of this command change. But I think the big thing is you take command on the 28th. Meade says right after the battle, I have aged more in 7 days than I have in the 48 years before this. And so that's got to play a consequence in the retreat. But that's not quite Caspian Sea, but hopefully. Thank you.
Okay, Quinn?
I was surprised that among your 7 critical decisions, you didn't include Longstreet's decision on the morning of the 3rd day not to aggressively implement Lee's orders. Could you speak to why that was not included?
Well, actually, that was one of the ones that we'd considered, and we came around. Again, we were trying to find consensus of what really affected the totality of the fight. This was a decision on the 3rd day, and as we discussed, what other options did Lee really have? I mean, it would have taken an enormous amount of moral courage to disengage. Longstreet, so the legends and the lore that have built up, didn't want to attack, dragged his feet. I don't know, I'm not so sure. What were his reasons? Well, if my boss just told me, you're going to take the last fresh troops that we've got, and I expect you to win this fight and break through at that little clump of trees over there, I might be inclined to take a long time make sure that everything is set, and George Pickett did graduate last in his class at West Point, so I'm going to make darn sure that George really gets what I want him to do, because he's the guy who's got to coordinate that division. So we did consider it, but and again, this was really tough, and we formed consensus over decisions that really affected the totality of this really significant battle.
Okay, we're going to take time for one last question right over here.
Okay, I hope this isn't an unfair question, but going from the strategic down to the tactical, Chancellor Fraser was an officer of the 140th Pennsylvania, and I believe that he was elevated, or he was a colonel at the time, or elevated to the regimental commander, because all the other officers in the regiment were killed in the Battle of Gettysburg. And I was just wondering if any of you have any knowledge of, what it was that the 140th Pennsylvania, what the actions were of the 140th Pennsylvania, or the involvement during the battle. I think they might have been involved at the wheat field, but I don't know if anybody has any knowledge of that.
I don't know.
Don't know.
Sorry.
Sorry, I think we struck out. You're entitled in a total of, this would be a total of 4.5, 6 hours of programming. That's the only one. So let's thank these.
You've stumped the chumps.
Yeah, let's thank these panelists.